If you have a job where you're on salary and get paid the same amount every paycheck, hey, life is easy. But what if your income is seasonal? Then how do you manage? Ted is here. Let's begin.
This is Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Ted, welcome back. So let's talk about seasonal workers. So give me an example of a seasonal worker.
Well, there's two different kinds. There's the kinds that are dependent on the weather that work outside, and then there's the kinds that are dependent on the time of year. So, for example, most retail outlets hire more people at Christmas. The outside workers would be construction, agriculture, tourism to some extent, basically anything where the primary activity is held outside. You may have noticed in Canada that the weather changes here.
I have not noticed that.
And certain types of jobs are more difficult when there's 3 feet of snow on the ground.
This is exactly right. And that's why I'm wearing a tie today, because the weather has started to get cooler. So I have to stay bundled up here in the freezing little studio. So,
you know, the flip of that side of that is true. Of course, you also have the guys that work in the ski industry or the snowmobiles or any of that sort of stuff. So we always think that seasonality is just a summer thing, but it's also a winter thing.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a bit about that as we go on, because that's the way you get rid of seasonality. Is I work at the golf course in the summer and the ski hill in the winter, and it all kind of works out. So, okay, so. But let's take the conventional examples that you've just given, construction or whatever. Sounds great. Get to work outside. Don't have to wear a stupid tie. It's all fantastic. What's the problem?
Well, it's a question of feast or famine. You don't really know what your hours are going to be like at the. Let's use the construction worker as an example. Somebody laying asphalt, driveways or highways or whatever it is. Well, the pits aren't open in the winter, so they're not doing anything till the spring. When they do open, they're slow to get going because they've got to prepare the surfaces and get everything ready to go, and they don't want bad weather to wipe out whatever work they do. So at the start of the season, they make nothing, and then they work crazy hours all through the summer in horrible situations, but that's a different discussion. And then in the fall, they try to keep going as long as possible, again, but at some point, the pits have to close, and that's the end of the job. So how do you prepare a budget when in February, March, you got nothing, and in August, you got crazy amounts of money?
And that's the topic of today's show. How in
crazy amounts of money?
How do you? Well, exactly what you just said. How do you prepare a budget when you've got, boom or bust, feast or famine? And in our latest course on budgeting, which is currently in post-production, we'll probably be releasing it probably in January. So you'll want to stay tuned for that. But one of the topics I discuss in that is irregular income.
Right.
And we're going to talk about debt in a minute with respect to irregular income, but
because that's what this show
is about. And like, how do you service your debt when you got irregular income? That's going to be what we're going to talk about. But on a more basic level than that, what is your advice for someone like that construction worker you talked about who makes a lot in the summer and very little in the winter? What do you do if you've got irregular income? How can you possibly manage? Well,
the only way you can really make a plan is to kind of smooth things out. Use averages or use some sort of projections where you know what the lows are going to be. You may not know what the highs are, but you can probably get a pretty good idea from what happened last year and try to just make a plan that smooths all of that out.
Yeah, because your expenses are going to be the same every month.
That's right.
Pretty much.
You got to live someplace, so probably you're renting an apartment, a condo, whatever, and it doesn't change when you're making big money in August versus low money in January.
Right. So let's say it costs me $3,000 a month to live. Mm-hmm. And in the summer, I make $6,000, and in the winter, I make $0. Okay, then I got to live on half my money.
Right. So that means you either got to prepay expenses or you've got to save money. I mean, the practical solution for us to tell you is that you should save money, but it's easier said than done. But particularly when you're working long hours, you don't think about setting aside money for the winter or your off season. You really have to.
Well, and the bigger problem I see, and I'm sure you see this all the time too, is a guy comes in to see you in the spring, who's a construction worker, and it's like, okay, I'm already behind. And so it takes all summer to get caught back up so that by the end of the summer, I'm back to even.
Right.
Okay, well, I can't. Now my income's dropping. I don't have any time to save. So you've got to get ahead of it. That's the only way you can possibly do it.
In the last decade, when interest rates were stupidly low, people would, okay, if I can't get everything done, I'll run up my line of credit through those winter months, and then, as you say, I'll pay it down when I go back to work. Well, that solution works, but you're paying somebody interest for using their money. If you can get ahead of it, as you said, then you won't be sending that money. You'll be able to spend it on yourself instead of paying it to some bank.
Well, and that's the trap we're going to talk about today, which is debt. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I rack up debt to survive because I don't have any other choice.
Right.
And that's particularly true. Like, when did you start your working career? Well, I finished high school, I finished college, whatever it was, I started working. If it's a seasonal job, then I certainly don't have any savings when I start.
Right.
And so maybe it takes that first season just to get me back to even again.
Maybe.
And then, and probably not, I've probably still got debt. And then boom, the slow period comes and now I'm more and more debt. So that's the first trap, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose we're talking about this because that trap, everybody gets stuck with it at some point. There's going to be some point in your life where suddenly your income disappears or just about dries up, but your expenses don't change overnight. And so we all recognize that things go wrong and there are solutions for that. But today's show, what we're talking about is people that know that their income is going to drop every year for a certain period of time. And we're trying to convince them to put together a plan so that they don't end up with all sorts of debt.
So let's talk about that, and we're going to do this as much practical as we possibly can. So, and I guess the final piece of the puzzle that's brutal is most loans, like a car loan, a mortgage, they've got a set monthly payment.
Right.
So when your income's all over the place, that makes it that much harder to manage. So you miss a payment, now you got late fees and you pay higher interest, so you stay in debt longer. So, okay, so let's go straight to practical advice. Normally we shave this to the end, but hey, we're 6 minutes into it. Let's go practical advice right now.
We're almost at the end.
We're almost at the end, but we're just going to do practical advice for the rest of it. So, okay, You've already hit on, I think, the first and most obvious thing, which is you've got to save during high income periods.
Right.
But easier said than done. So how do you walk someone through that process? What do you tell them? What's your thought process there?
Well, we don't like using the word budget, so we're going to call it a plan. You need to know what it costs you to live on a minimum basis every month. So what's your rent going to be, your car payment, your insurance, your groceries if you're not working crazy hours and all sorts of stuff. How much does it cost you to live? And then you got to discipline yourself to actually live on that when you're making all this extra money during the really busy times. And anything that's excess, you put it away for the rainy day, because unlike the rest of us, you know when your next rainy day is going to come as soon as things slow down in the fall, the spring, whatever your slow period is from work.
So using my example of the person who has $3,000 a month in living expenses, and let's assume those are pretty consistent throughout the year.
Yep.
I mean, maybe your living expenses go up a bit during the busy time because I'm traveling to work more, or I'm got to eat out more because I'm on the road all the time or whatever. So if I work 6 months of the year and I'm off 6 months of the year just because that's how my seasonal job works.
Right.
And your example of the guy who's driving the gravel dump truck,
sure,
that's probably about 6 months of the year because you can't start too early because it's all mud and you can't get on the job sites and everything.
Yep.
So maybe you're starting, April at the earliest, probably more like May, June, July, August, September, October.
Right.
Well, you probably work into November as well, but it's kind of half the year on, half the year off. So you literally have to live on half your money then. That's
right.
There's no other way to do it other than that.
Yeah. And the folks on the East Coast have been doing this for every year. I mean, because of the fisheries industries, right? But you and I aren't experts on that, so we don't think of that example.
You're right. and that would be a classic example. So, okay. So number one, most important, you got to save during the high income periods.
Right.
And I like your word plan because I agree. I don't like budgeting either. But you have to look ahead a year and go, okay, how much do I need to get through the year? How much am I making in the boom times? Therefore, this is how much I've got to save to mitigate it.
Now, are you in an industry that qualifies for EI during those months that you're off? And if you are, how long do you have to wait before you start to receive it? All of this has to be planned in as well, right? So the example we've been using, I need $3,000 a month to live, and in the summer months, I'm making $6,000 because I'm working my tail off. And then come November, December, it just dries up. Well, if you qualify for EI, you're probably going to get, $1,800 if you make $3,000, something in that neighborhood. So you need to have at least $1,200 a month from some extra source, the savings that we're talking about, to get by. If you don't qualify for EI, you need the whole $3,000. If you know you're going to have to wait 8 weeks for the damn EI, then you've got to have enough to cover the first 2 months.
Yeah, and then the EI maybe continues on
It's all just a mess.
So yeah, I think you literally have to plot it out.
Yep.
Okay, get a piece of paper and a pen, and here's my 12 columns, and here's what I think I'm going to bring in. Or if you're a fancy guy and can use a spreadsheet, fine, do that.
Put it on your phone somehow.
I'm sure the phone will do it for you as well. So, okay, so practical advice. Number one, you got to save during the high income periods, and the only way to do that is to have a plan that covers the whole year. The second obvious thing, and this is our advice for everybody, is an emergency fund. So explain your thoughts on that. Like, what are we talking about there?
Well, so back in when did the barber first release his book? In the 50s? 60s?
I think he's our age. So you're talking about the wealthy barber. I'm sure David is listening. Going,
David, are you listening?
I'm as old as you guys. Come on. What are you talking about?
The advice wasn't his advice to set aside 10% of whatever you make.
No, that's been advice. Yeah, that's been advice for, you're right, 100 years.
Right. And so the idea behind an emergency fund is you set some money aside because even if you don't know when the emergency is going to happen, you know at some point something's going to go wrong. You're going to need a major repair for the car. You're going to have to move very quickly because something's happened to your apartment or home. And there's always something. And so an emergency fund is where you try to accumulate, 1 or 2 months. Some people have gone so far as to suggest 3, worth in a savings account. So you've got this cash setting aside for the emergency.
So you're talking about the same thing twice here, right? So you're saying, I need to, in our example, we're saying, well, I got to save $3,000 a month. Maybe it's $2,000 a month I got to save during the busy times, so I've got that in the slow times. But then I also, on top of that, have to have emergency money? Yeah,
so the emergency fund advice is for everyone. In our particular example today, because we're talking about seasonal workers, it's an extra challenge for you because let me hit you with this horrible bombshell. So you're a seasonal worker, things wind down in November, and you're pretty sure you're going back to work in April, except you don't. And so now what do you do?
Gotcha. Or while you're off work, your car breaks down or something else happens. So I thought my living expenses were going to be $3,000 a month, but it turns out they were 4 or 5. You got to have the extra money. So you're right, a challenge for everybody, but an additional challenge for somebody with irregular income. Okay, so we're talking about income. Then the thought that pops into my head is, okay, I got to figure out a way to have more income then.
Right.
I've got to pad my income somehow. Mm-hmm. So what can I do there? What's my thought process?
Well, so you know which months you're going to be busiest. Don't say no to the overtime unless it's going to kill you. Work as many hours as you can and sock that extra money away instead of using it, spending it at the time that you earn it. Maybe you need to look at getting a second job or a second source of income, some kind of gig position, things that you could do during the off season so that you don't need to save as much.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely critical, if at all possible. And I realize it's easy for us to say, maybe harder in practice. If my skill is I'm a dump truck driver, which I assume requires some kind of special license, right?
It does, actually.
A fancy thing.
It's a Class D.
Class D, there you go.
I got one of those.
I'm sure you do. Ted has all the different classes of licenses. And how many different classes of licenses are there?
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, M.
M for motorcycle.
Motorcycles.
I've got a G.
Right.
So
B is school buses. I don't have.
You don't have that one. Okay,
I can't drive a school bus.
So you don't have that's. There's a challenge for 2025 for Ted. Get your school bus license because that would be a good gig work if this whole podcasting thing doesn't work out for you.
That's paying well so far.
Absolutely. And how many sponsors do we have, Ted? 0. We have 0 sponsors. So the obvious. So okay, I've got my. What did you say? A D license we're talking about here.
You're driving a truck.
And so what do I use that for in the winter? Well, a snowplow is probably a D license, is it?
If you're lucky. It depends on the weight of the vehicle, but probably.
It could be. So, okay, that would be a logical thing then, but you're not plowing snow for 6 straight months. And so, but maybe I can pick up some, work doing that using the same skill that I'm using in the summer. But if my skill is, I don't know, I'm working a lawnmower or something, that's kind of harder to do in the winter. But I think what you want to look for is whatever the industry is that's counter-cyclical to your industry. So right. I work at a golf course and then I work shoveling snow. I do landscaping and then I do shoveling snow. I work at a retail store and then I go to the ski hill.
A lot of shoveling snow.
Oh man, the looking forward to the winter, obviously. But you have to think about that well in advance, obviously, right. And have some kind of plan. So it's again easier said than done. But if you can switch from one job to the other, rock and roll, then none of what we're talking about matters.
No, you still need the emergency fund.
You still need the emergency fund. Okay. So we've talked about the income side of it. Do what you can to supplement your income. what about the debt side of it? So is it possible to arrange your debt payments, if you have them, to be higher in the busy season, lower in the slow season?
So there are a couple different ways to do that. One is to actually get it written into the contract, which is a little more complicated because most places they won't think outside the box.
We do it once a month. That's how it is.
But you can prepay. So let's say my payment on my debt is $250, and in the summer months I decide to pay $375. I pay a month and a half. I'm paying the month down more quickly. What you got to do is make sure that you're going to get proper credit for that in the slow months in the winter, so it's not that you're paying extra now and then you start missing a bunch of payments.
Right.
Because that'll affect your credit report.
Wow. So, okay, let's talk about a credit card then. Right. So a credit card, typically you have to pay, let's say it's 3% of the outstanding balance plus the interest.
Right.
So, and let's say that number is $300. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is, okay, well, in the summer, pay $600. But that doesn't work because then you get to December, you still have to pay $300.
Well, whatever it is, yes.
So what do you do there? What's your credit card strategy then?
So now you're going to have to rely on those savings accounts, the money that you set aside, because you aren't going to get a credit card company that's going to let you pay more in the summer and less in the winter.
Right. So it's great. My total debt went from, $5,000 down to $2,000. So I've still got borrowing room and everything.
Right.
But I have to be making a minimum payment. So I guess our number one piece of advice would be, well, pay your credit card off in full. That would be the obvious thing. But unfortunately, cash is tight.
You get the question you just begged there is, if I've got all this extra income and I can afford the credit card off in full, but that means I won't be able to save any money. Now what do I do?
That's a good question. What's the answer?
Right. Pay the debt down first.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in the month of October, our biggest Instagram reel was you and I talking about that exact topic.
Right.
What do I do? Should I save or should I invest? And our answer is almost always, well, you should pay down your debt.
Right.
Because your credit card is 20% interest. So unless you're some great stock trader whose crypto trades are making you more than 20%, it's always the better thing. But so in that case, okay, so I've got $6,000 owing on my credit card. Over the course of my busy time, I pay it down in full. So now I've got a completely unused credit card.
Right.
But then the winter gets here, I start using the credit card.
Right.
I still have to have the cash available to be making the minimum payments.
Yep. I mean, what we're telling you is that you've got to be able to do both. You've got to be able to pay down the debt and still save some money for that period of time when you know your income's lower.
And this is why we go back to the original point, which is making a plan. I've got my piece of paper with 12 columns on it. Here's what the income's going to be, but here's what my debt payments are going to be. Some months I've got to make them higher, lower, whatever. I got to see what's coming. Now, you mentioned that most lenders, like credit card companies, are not going to allow you to just make flexible payments.
Right.
Is that possible, though, with something like a mortgage or a car loan or an installment loan, or is that also very difficult?
All of that's going to be difficult to get a lender to think outside the box unless it's some sort of personalized lender.
I guess a line of credit, if it's an interest, if it's an interest-only line of credit, you still got to pay the interest every month.
Right.
You got no choice of it. So you've really got to think about that. There really is. It's very difficult then to have an income-based repayment plan. That's just not a thing.
Right.
Again, back to practical advice, there are certainly a bunch of budgeting tools. You mentioned using apps and things like that.
Yep.
And so, we're big fans of that as well. I'm talking about the most simple way, which is a piece of paper and a pen. I guess you could use a pencil.
You could.
Depends how much of a rebel you are. Do you think you're going to make a mistake or not? Do you remember in grade 10 bookkeeping class, you had to use a pen and you had to just put a single line through the numbers? Mm-hmm. Do you remember that? Everybody's watching this going, yeah, we use computers now, dude. We weren't alive in the 70s.
What was the computer in my grade 10? Commodore PET.
There you go. I do remember that. I didn't really start using a computer till university, but that was 40 years ago. So if you can use the technology, great. Okay, now let's talk about this, back to this point though about the savings. So I know that I'm going to have to be making minimum payments on my car payment, my mortgage, my line of credit, whatever.
My rent.
Yeah, exactly. Everything. And so during the course of the busy season, I'm able to save up a bunch of money. Should I be putting that in a savings account? Should I be putting it in a TFSA, an RSP? Where should I be putting it, or does it matter?
Well, if you put it in any kind of registered savings, you can't really withdraw it without taking some kind of penalty. So, for example, if you put money in an RSP in the summer and then you have to take it out in February, you get a tax deduction for the year before, but you get a tax hit the year that you take it out. And so that's probably not getting you where you want to go. TFSAs are great because the money that you put in, anything that it earns, is tax-free. And when you take the money out, it's tax-free. So that's a more practical solution than a registered savings plan. Now, what about a regular savings account? The only difference between that and a TFSA is, of course, you're going to get taxed on any income that you make in that savings account.
But, okay, so I managed to save up $3,000 during the summer, and they're paying me 1% interest.
Right.
It's kind of irrelevant, right?
It is. It's just another line in your tax return.
Right. And the big difference between, well, there's two differences between the TFSA and the RSP. One of them is what you just said, the tax implication. But with a TFSA, if you put the money back in, your limit resets again.
Right.
Whereas with an RSP, once you've used it, that's it. It's gone. You've burned it forever. So I completely agree with you. I would not be using an RRSP as a savings vehicle, except for either retirement or I'm going off on maternity leave for 5 years, going back to school.
First-time home buyers.
And a first-time home buyer. And, of course, there's a specific program for that, which we've talked about in this show before.
Right.
Maybe we can put a link in the show notes to that. I don't know how to do that, but hopefully our technical team knows how to do that. So a TFSA kind of makes sense.
Right.
Because I can take the money out in December and then next summer I can put it back in and I haven't used up my contribution room. But for all the hassle, you might as well put it in a savings account.
Right, for all the difference that it makes.
Like unless we're talking significant dollars here.
I mean, the only bit of practical advice I'd like to give you is, so when you're doing that in the high income seasons, put it in an account that you can't just go online and transfer the money to your checking account. Make it a little more difficult to get at, just so you're not tempted to grab it.
Yeah, and that's a big advantage of a TFSA. It's not on your debit card. You can't go to the store and spend it. So either have a separate savings account, so it's not in your day-to-day account, or have a separate savings account at a separate bank.
Right, and then don't carry that card with you.
Right, it's completely, it's hidden. So you've got your main bank, one of the big five, because, we all love the big five, don't we, Ted?
Right.
But I could go to one of the small guys who are all owned by the big five, like Simply Financial or Tangerine or one of those guys. No fees. I can easily transfer money from one to the other, but then it's completely separate. It's a different card. I can't see.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Now, you kind of hinted at the whole tax issue here, too.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm an employee, do I have to worry about that?
Well, so if you're a seasonal employee, what you're going to discover is, and you've probably noticed this in the past, you're taxed at whatever your biweekly or weekly or monthly pay is at. So whatever they take that, multiply it by 12 months, that's the tax rate that they tax you at. So if you're really busy for 6 months of the year, you're probably being taxed more aggressively than you should be, because 6 months of the year you're doing nothing. Unless you're in some kind of self-employment or subcontractor mode, which just complicates this whole conversation.
Yeah, totally different. Yeah, so you're right. Your employer uses a computer probably.
Right, with charts and graphs, and you make this much, I take this much.
Right, so if you made $5,000 this month, the computer assumes your income is going to be $60,000 for the year. That puts you in this tax bracket. Here it is.
Right.
But if you're only working for 6 months of the year, your income's only in the $30,000 range, so you're in a lower tax bracket potentially.
You should be getting a refund.
So so that's, you don't have to worry about it. But if you are self-employed, you're paying zero taxes.
Right.
That's where you get hammered.
Mm-hmm.
And so our advice has always been, if you're self-employed, send money to CRA every month. Like I got paid this month, send it to them.
Yep.
And that way you have no worries. It's done. It's good. And then the whole savings thing is less important, because when tax season comes, I've already paid it and I'm good. Right. That would be potentially a good use for a TFSA, because then it's out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
But why not just send it directly to CRA?
Yep.
Like then it's gone. You can't
take it.
You can't get into trouble. Okay, now the final point on this list of practical advice, and you already kind of hit on it, is government assistance programs. So obviously things like EI, you should understand how that works and then factor that into your budget.
Right.
It's pretty much, it's another line item, and there you go.
Yep.
So okay, so on the practical advice list, we went through a whole bunch of stuff: saving during high income periods, emergency funds, getting your income smoothed out, flexible payment plans, and savings and government assistance. But there's also a whole mindset to all this too.
There is.
And so okay, forgetting about the numbers and budgets and everything, how do you have to think about this? What has to go through your brain in terms of a mindset shift?
So remember what we said. You've got to figure out, what does it cost you to live every month? And that's what you base all of your planning on. I got to have this much money every month to live. If you are really busy in the summer and you make huge dollars and you plan your whole year based on making huge dollars and suddenly you don't, you're in a whole world of trouble. Whereas if you plan on that minimum amount you got to have and you're making huge dollars, well, then you got extra. You got surplus. Surplus, you have options. When you got a deficit, you don't have options. You just got problems.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the most important key in this whole discussion. Live your life based on the minimums.
Right.
And then when you've got extra money, you're good, as opposed to, hey, I made this much this month, I can spend that much. Right. So I know what it takes to pay my rent, to pay my groceries, transportation, minimum cost, whatever. That's the number I got to focus on. Yep. And anything extra gets banked. If you can do that, then you're going to be way ahead of the crowd. And then obviously you got to be flexible in all this too, right?
That's true.
Because there's always something that changes, always something that's going to throw you for a loop. And so it's great to say, plot it out for 12 months. Yeah, good luck with that, because none of your numbers are going to be right.
Things happen. There's another word that's used there, but we're not going to use it on our program.
Because we want to keep the general audience so that you can listen to this show while you're driving your kids to school, as I'm sure everybody does. You also, I'm talking about month to month and over the course of a year, but you got to look at this a bit more long term too. That's true, right?
I mean, we're always telling people the only one who's really interested in your financial success is you, right?
Nobody else cares.
Your family members are as well, because they're dependent on you. But anyone trying to sell you something, they don't really care. They'll sell you whatever they can to get their lights for them. So you have to have a certain long-term perspective or long-term view to all of these discussions as well. You got to survive month to month, but you got to have some kind of plan or goal for the longer term, or you're not going to get there.
Yeah, we're saying, okay, by the end of the busy season, I've got to have enough money to get me through the slow season, but I don't want to end the slow season at zero. I'd like to end it with a couple of bucks,
right?
Because that's the couple of bucks that ends up going into the retirement fund, my kids' education fund, and so on.
Right.
So you really do have to have a much longer term view of that in order to make that work.
And we get it. We know how tough all that is, particularly given the inflation rate the last few years and just the cost of living's gone crazy. But it's, again, you're the only one who cares whether or not you succeed.
Yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, we absolutely get it, because we are dealing with people every day who are in exactly that situation.
Right.
And your advice that, okay, during the boom times, maybe I got to work some extra overtime because you got to make hay while the sun shines. So I've got extra. It's tough. It's tiring. It means you can't see your family as much. We're not saying you got to do that for the rest of your life, but if you can get to zero on your debt and then start to put a couple of bucks away, then you're rolling.
Right.
So let's end this on a positive spin, if at all possible. I think everything we've talked about has been positive. So are there any off the top of your head ways about how do I stay motivated during this? Because it's great during the busy times because I got money coming in, but then during the slow times, it's tough. What can you do to kind of keep yourself on track?
Well, so one of the easiest things to do is set goals for yourself, and then when you achieve those goals, celebrate them. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be something complicated. Say you got 3 credit cards. So one of your goals is to pay off the one with the highest interest or the one with the highest balance. Doesn't matter. One of them is going to be paid off. And then when you do get it paid off, that's great. Give yourself some kind of treat, some kind of reward, because you've achieved a goal. That's good.
Yep. Yeah, and I'm a systems guy as opposed to a goal guy, but I agree with what you're saying that you got to have a system where every paycheck during the busy season, I'm putting this much into my TFSA or RSP or something, it's totally gone. And yeah, by all means, go out and have a hamburger every now and then. Like we're not telling you to live like a hermit or anything like that.
Right.
You got to have a bit of fun as well. So there you go. Those are our thoughts on seasonal workers and both income and debt. It's not easy.
No,
like it's really hard.
If it wasn't easy, we wouldn't have a job.
Exactly, and we wouldn't have done this show. But I think we've given you a bunch of practical things that you can focus on, and hopefully that will get you closer to where you need to be. So let's do the commercial. If you're currently listening to this podcast or watching on the Debt Free in 30 channel on YouTube, we'd like to remind you to check out the Hoyes Michalos channel. You know where we got that name from, Ted? Neither do I.
Wasn't one of our sponsors.
No, it was not. It was from, in case you didn't know, I'm Doug Hoyes. That's Ted Michalos. I forgot to introduce us at the start of the show. So we've got a bunch of in-depth educational content there as well. So just go search for Hoyes Michalos.
Well, and we've been doing this a long time, folks. If you got financial questions, do a search on it. We probably have a video on it already.
Yep. We put out a video pretty much every day during the week on one of our different channels. We're trying to get the information out because it always frustrates us when we talk to someone and they go, oh, I didn't know that.
Right.
Okay. Well, here you go.
Means we're not doing our job communicating it to them.
We're doing the best we can, and we will continue to do that, including next week when we are back for another edition of Debt Free in 30. There's one every week, so please like, subscribe, notification bell. I don't know what else you're supposed to do. Leave a comment on both YouTube or any of our podcasting channels, Spotify, Apple, and so on.
Right.
So until next week, thanks for listening. I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.